Let me ask you a question that most adults can't answer. Who are you without your job? Really? I mean, you, when no one needs anything, when you're not producing and you're not proving yourself. If you struggle to answer that question, well, then that silence is the real story. Most of us build our entire adult lives around a single identity. The professional one, the one that earns the money, gets the promotions, and pays the bills. And for a while, that's necessary. It gives structure, safety, and direction. But at some point in your enough journey, that single identity stops being enough. Because life has a way of shifting the ground from under you. What happens when your role is made redundant, or AI reshapes your industry, or you finally become financially free? What happens when you become a parent for the first time, and suddenly the job isn't the center of your world anymore? If your identity is tied exclusively to work, then the moment work becomes smaller, or disappears completely, you're left without a sense of who you are. And that's a terrifying place to be. This episode is about building something stronger and far more interesting. Identity enough. The identity that exists beyond work. The one you actually get to keep. You've built the career. You're building the portfolio. You're close to freedom. So what now? Welcome to Life After Enough. Money, meaning, and the life you design when work becomes optional. I'm Nick. I'm racing towards early retirement and figuring out who I become when the job no longer dictates what I do with my time. Let's get into it. Today's episode is a whopper, and one which I really enjoyed exploring. We're diving into one of the most important parts of this whole journey. This is the one pillar of enough that is foundational. And as you'll hear during this episode, this is one that I've probably struggled with the most. It's the one that people often avoid talking about, and when they do, it's usually in vague, fluffy language, but not here. Today, we're taking a hard look at identity enough, who you are when work isn't the center of your universe anymore. Identity work is essential for everyone, and definitely not just those who are on the path to fire. It makes you more resilient, more fulfilled, and far less likely to panic when external forces shift and change your life. So grab some coffee, fasten your seatbelt, and let's start doing the work together. Something that nobody teaches us growing up is that when your whole identity is tied to your job, you become extremely fragile. And I don't mean emotionally fragile, I mean structurally fragile. Because just stop for a moment and actually think about what happens if the job goes. From a redundancy, a restructure, AI automation, leadership changes, or you simply wake up one day and think, I can't do this for another 30 years. In those cases, when your identity equals your job, then any shake in the job shakes you. A bad email feels very personal. A missed promotion feels like a life failure. And a restructure at work, well, that feels like an existential threat to you and your family. You end up giving your career the power to hurt you in ways it honestly shouldn't. When your job becomes your identity, those work wobbles stop just being noise and start feeling like identity collapse. Identity enough is about becoming anti-fragile, not becoming dependent on a single role, a single title, or a single institution for your sanity, self-worth, or happiness. It's about building a sense of self that stays standing even if your job doesn't. I felt this in the most intense way when running my own businesses. When it's your name on the door, and when you've given so much of yourself, every setback feels very personal. A client issue, a slow month, or a mistake, it doesn't just register as business turbulence. It lands as a direct smash to your face, your values, and your worth. That was one of the biggest wake-up calls for me. If your identity is fused to your work, then your entire emotional world rises and falls due to things happening solely at work. Let me take you back to 2016. I was a lawyer in London, corporate, predictable, respectable on LinkedIn, and completely disconnected from who I actually was. I was stuck in the cycle of earn, get stressed, spend money to get rid of the stress, and repeat. I was buying moments of escape to offset the emptiness I felt at work. At first, it was small things, nicer holidays, weekends away, expensive dinners. Then it became something bigger. mountaineering. What started as a hobby quickly turned into my entire outlet. It was the only place I felt alive and challenged and present. I'd spend months training, investing in gear, planning routes, and learning new skills. And slowly, without even realizing it, my identity began to shift. I wasn't Nick the lawyer anymore. I was becoming Nick the mountaineer, Nick the novice adventurer, and Nick who felt more himself on a glacier at 4 a.m. than he ever did in a meeting room. Over 3 years, the climbs got more advanced, more technical, and more ambitious, and every mountain became a way to run from the version of me who was slowly drowning in corporate life. And then one day, almost on instinct, I signed up for a month-long expedition in the unforgiving wilds of Alaska to climb Mount Denali. For everyone who doesn't know, Denali is no casual hill walk. It's the highest mountain in North America, 6,190 meters tall. But what makes it brutal is the weather. Think Arctic storms, crevasses that could literally swallow a bus, hauling a 30-kilogram backpack and dragging a 40-kilogram sled while living on a glacier for weeks. No porters carrying stuff, no cozy lodges, and absolutely no easy exits. Just you, your team, and conditions that quite literally do not care whether you make it back or not. It's the kind of expedition people train a year for. It's the kind that your mum absolutely does not want you doing. The kind where the margin for error is tiny, but the personal growth is massive. And that decision to climb Denali changed absolutely everything. Because I think for the first time in my adult life, I prioritized something other than work. Training for this expedition was not optional. It was life or death on the mountain. So suddenly, my job, the thing I'd let totally define and consume me, had to take second place. I valued my life more than the next deal, email, or performance review. And up on that mountain, in the cold, in the silence, in the kind of physical exhaustion you can't fake your way through, something shifted in me. I'd spent years grinding, spending, escaping, but Denali forced me to meet myself properly for the first time. Because when you've dragged a sled for hours in minus 30 degrees Celsius winds, when you've stood clipped into a rope team on a ridge where one step means goodbye, and when you've lived for weeks without any of the noise or nonsense of normal life, you learn something about who you are. That climb broke me open in the best possible way. It showed me I was capable of so much more than the version of myself who sat in endless meetings feeling half alive. It gave me a confidence that if I could survive that, I could change anything. My work, my life, my direction, all of it suddenly felt negotiable. When I came home from that expedition, it hit me with absolute clarity. This cannot be my life for the next 30 years. And because I am, well, me, I didn't quietly adjust course. I didn't make a thoughtful little life transition plan. Instead, I blew the whole thing up. I quit my job. I launched a mountain fitness company. It failed spectacularly. I started a legal consultancy, became a digital nomad, moved countries, moved continents, eventually rebuilding a legal career in Singapore, but on my own terms. Looking back, I can admit I could have done all of that very differently. I could have absolutely tried things on the side, tested the ideas, built a bridge instead of jumping off the cliff. But I also know that that explosion was the first time my identity cracked open. It showed me that I wasn't just a lawyer. I could be more. I could reinvent, pivot, and I could choose. It was the first taste of identity enough I'd ever experienced, long before I even knew the phrase existed. And if I could sit down with my 2016 self now, I would probably say you didn't need to detonate your life to feel free. You could have experimented slowly and safely. You didn't have to go full Nick on a mission. But honestly, I'm really glad I did do it the dramatic Nick way, because in doing so, it set me free. It broke the mental prison, and it gave me evidence that identity is flexible. Now, am I recommending you follow that exact approach? Absolutely not. In fact, please don't. Because swinging from one extreme to the other is why I'm still doing the deep identity work today. Instead, the lesson I'd love for you to take away from this episode is that you don't have to burn your life down to reinvent yourself. You don't have to quit your job to try something new, and you don't have to go all in for your identity to evolve. It's okay to experiment in small, safe, intentional ways, trying on new identities like outfits, whilst building a richer, more layered you without detonating the old one. And not only can you do that, you absolutely should. Trying new identities is how you build the internal flexibility that makes you anti-fragile. It also unlocks something quite surprising. When you've got multiple identities, work stops feeling so suffocating. Suddenly, your job isn't your whole life anymore. Instead, work becomes something you contribute to, but not something that defines you. It's just one part of your life, a supporting role, but not the main character. And paradoxically, having other identities can actually make your career feel lighter, more meaningful, and even more enjoyable, because you're no longer asking the job to be everything. This is especially powerful for anyone who shares my personality type, the all or nothing, high achiever, deeply committed, I give 110% until I collapse type. It's part of my charm, but also part of my chaos. Because when you only have one identity, you overgive to protect it. But when you build a few, you naturally introduce boundaries and perspective. Your world gets bigger, not smaller. Identity enough is built on small pivots, experiments, and mini tries. It's simply learning to become someone who can choose new identities and not someone stuck in performing an old one. And I think that is a real superpower. People who can pivot will always have a place in the world, no matter how much it changes. The one caveat here, though, is that it doesn't apply to toxic environments. Too many people stay in toxic work relationships for too long. If your workplace is just toxic, sadly, identity work won't save you, but a new job probably will. Before we jump into some of the lessons I learned during my sabbatical, there's one more identity trap we do need to talk about. Because it isn't just the people who love their jobs who fuse their identity to work. It's also the people who hate their jobs as well. That version can be just as toxic, probably even more so. Here's what I mean. If your whole identity becomes, I can't wait to leave, I hate this place, this job is ruining my life, I need out now. Well, then your entire sense of self gets built around escaping. Your identity isn't the lawyer or the consultant anymore. It becomes the person trying to escape from being a lawyer or consultant. And that's just as fragile. Because what happens the moment you finally do leave? Suddenly, there's no villain. There's no structure to rebel against. There's no enemy to blame and no narrative to fight. The adrenaline that kept you going disappears. And you're still left with this empty space you've never explored. You escape the job, but you're still carrying the identity of someone trying to escape the job. And that's when people completely spiral. I thought leaving work would fix everything. Why do I still feel lost? Why am I not happy yet? As I've mentioned many times on this podcast, running away from something is not the same as running towards something. And look, I have been there. I used to think that once I finally stepped away from work, once I wasn't chained to deadlines and corporate politics, everything would magically click in place. But when the noise stopped, the need to escape identity was still there. The restlessness was still there. The emptiness was still there. All I'd done was remove the job, but not the mindset. If you imagine the moment you walk away will feel like freedom, but all you've done and practiced for years is running, then suddenly you don't know how to arrive. And that brings us to the next part of my story. Quick pause. If this episode is sparking something for you, hit follow so you don't miss what's coming next. Feel free to share it with someone who'd love it too. It really helps the show to grow. In 2025, I took 6 months off. On paper, it was for the most amazing reasons. Getting married, enjoying our honeymoon properly, and then easing into married life without sprinting back into the corporate spin cycle. But underneath all that, something else was going on. I'd slip back into my familiar escape from work identity, that pattern where I make my job the villain and freedom the solution, especially as I'd already reached my original fire number. But there was another identity forming too, a quieter, more insidious one. I started telling myself a new story. Nick, you're turning 40. Your body can't do what it used to do. You're past the big physical challenges. You're not the mountaineering guy anymore. You're older now. I had unconsciously built myself yet another new cage, and this time it was very small, and I convinced myself that that was the reality. During the sabbatical, we had planned to go to Nepal, a trip I dreamed about. And when we had to cancel it because my husband's grandfather passed away, I felt almost relieved. Not totally devastated about missing the adventure, but relieved I wouldn't have to test myself. Relieved I wouldn't have to confront the story I'd started to believe. And that was one of the biggest wake-up calls during the whole sabbatical. I'd escaped one identity trap and walked straight into another. At that point, my old escape impulse kicked in. Maybe I'll just take a trip. That'll sort me out. Which is hilarious because that was literally the behavior I was trying to break. But thankfully, something inside finally snapped, in a good way. I realized I didn't need another stamp in my passport. What I needed was to go out and get uncomfortable again in a different way. So I walked into a CrossFit style class, one of those ones where people throw barbells around at 7 a.m. like it's nothing. And I loved every second of that first session, though my legs barely functioned for 2 or 3 days later. I kept going every weekday, religiously. After months of telling myself I was completely past it, I realized that I wasn't. That part of me, the physically capable, disciplined, slightly unhinged adventurer, he was still there, just buried under years of work stress and self-doubt. Those classes didn't just make me fitter, they made me feel like me again, the version of me I'd forgotten existed. And that's when it really hit home. Identity isn't something you think your way into, it's something you do your way into. It's built through tiny, uncomfortable actions, not grand reinventions. In the messy middle of my sabbatical, where everything felt blurry and maybe a little bit pointless even, those brutal, sweaty, humbling classes became my anchor. Proof I could still change, still grow, and still choose who I wanted to be next. I think part of me expected a sabbatical epiphany, like I'd wake up one morning and the universe would hand me my next chapter on a golden platter. Instead, what grounded me most were the simplest, smallest things. Showing up for that CrossFit class every day, learning to cook new recipes, shaping this podcast from scratch, weekly paddle sessions with friends, slow mornings, long walks, and actual presence. Nothing particularly dramatic, nothing really Instagrammable, but just small, consistent anchors that made me feel more like myself than any job title ever has. And what's the best part? Well, I've kept them going now that I'm back at work. Something else landed during the sabbatical too, and it hit harder than I expected. I realized that other from my foray into mountaineering, I'd always allowed work to consume me because I never built anything strong enough outside of it. Work was the only place I invested meaning, identity, energy, and validation. So of course it swallowed me whole. Of course I constantly felt that push factor. And of course I always fantasized about escape. It wasn't the work itself. It was the imbalance. I'd given work all the space where the rest of my identity should have been growing. And when work was the only identity I had, any wobble at work felt a wobble in me. And that's how you end up emotionally held hostage by your job. And your job's not even doing anything wrong. So instead, now, I'm approaching identity with intention and not instinct. I'm experimenting. I'm trying things on, keeping the things that ground me and then letting go of things that drain me, adding layers to who I am without burning the old ones down. This slow, intentional reinvention and process of rebuilding a self that exists beyond work, well, it's the first time I've felt real, sustainable growth. Not escape, not avoidance, but growth. Before we move on to the realities of work taking over your identity, I want to touch on another huge identity shift, one that I've been thinking about a lot recently as I explore the path to parenthood. Parenthood is one of the biggest identity transformations a person can go through. And unlike switching careers or taking a sabbatical, it's an identity that is both chosen, but also given to you by life. It's planned for, you prepare, you hope, you imagine what it might be like, but it's also something that arrives in one giant moment and instantly reshapes the entire landscape of your life. Parenthood is probably the most powerful force that pulls your identity away from being tied solely to work. Not because work suddenly becomes irrelevant, it usually very much doesn't, but because something else becomes more important. But there's another side of it too, and this is the part people don't always talk about openly. I think parenthood can also become a new identity trap. Becoming a parent is so consuming, so emotionally and physically demanding, so all-encompassing that a lot of people just lose themselves completely to it without realizing. And to be honest, how many friends have you had who've had a baby and then you basically never see them again for 2 or 3 years? It's not because they've stopped liking you or that there was a fallout or suddenly they become antisocial, but because their identity shifted overnight. Their social life, their hobbies, their sense of self, all of it got temporarily swallowed by this new enormous identity. And this is not a criticism. I think it's just naturally what happens when something so big lands in your life. Parenthood changes the gravity of everything around it. But in the same way people become only the lawyer, others slip into only being the mum or the dad. In many ways, it's kind of inevitable, but it should only be for a period of time. The risk, and the thing I'm thinking about a lot as I consider fatherhood, is this. If your identity becomes only work or only parenthood, you still lose the parts of yourself that need space, creativity, joy, challenge, and expression. And those parts really matter. They matter to you as a person, as a partner, and as a parent too. Because I think children learn identity from what we model, not from what we say. If all they see is an exhausted parent, or a parent whose self-identity is wrapped around obligation, or a parent who never has anything that belongs only to them, then that becomes the template they inherit. But there's another layer that people also don't talk about. When your identity collapses into just being a parent, the pressure on the child and on your partner becomes unbearably heavy. You see it all the time. The helicopter parenting, the tiger parent pressure. Every success of the child feels like your success. Every failure feels like your failure. You start living through them instead of alongside of them. I think that is just so suffocating for the kid, and it must be absolutely exhausting for the parent. It's something I've had to sit with as we imagine our life with kids someday. Who will I be as a dad? How do I make sure that identity expands me rather than erases me? And how do I keep the parts of myself that matter, the parts I've worked so hard to rediscover? Is it possible to live my fire dream and have kids? Parenthood isn't the opposite of identity enough, but it does ask you to be intentional in a different way, to build enough margin and self before parenthood so that you don't disappear into the role forever. If I'm lucky enough to step into that chapter, I want to bring a full, robust identity with me, because I think that the richer and more grounded you are as a person, the richer and steadier you'll be as a parent. Before we move on to practical steps, I also want to pause here and talk to the people who are listening and thinking, Nick, this is all very nice, but I don't have the luxury of reinventing anything. Maybe you've already got young kids. Maybe you're just on a visa like I am, and work isn't just a job, it's the thing holding your entire life in place. Maybe your financial situation genuinely leaves no spare bandwidth. If that's you, I see you, and I get it on a really personal level. There were years when my entire identity had to be the lawyer, because without it, I couldn't pay rent. I couldn't stay in Singapore, and I couldn't build any stability. When your job is the thing that keeps the roof over your head and the ground under your feet, it's impossible not to get wrapped up in it. So yes, some of this identity work is absolutely a privilege, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But even if your life is full, you're not out of options. Identity isn't built with wide open schedules, but in the margins. And the margins really matter. Identity is shaped in tiny, repeated moments that maybe no one else even sees. That 15 minutes you protect before bed to read instead of scrolling. That's identity. The Friday morning walk you refuse to cancel because it keeps you sane. That's identity. Cooking just one new dish a week because it makes you feel creative. That's also identity. Those tiny pockets are not too small to matter. They're the first cracks of light that remind you, I exist outside of my job. I exist outside of my responsibilities. I exist outside what people need from me. And if the current season of your life doesn't give you big, dramatic amounts of free time, fine, then take the slivers. Protect them fiercely. Slivers compound just like money does. And if all you can do right now is claim a small corner of the day that belongs only to you, that still counts. Way more than you might think. Because that's the moment you remember, I'm not just a worker or a mum or a dad, I'm still me. And from that tiny foothold, everything else becomes possible. Okay, so as we usually do, let's make this real. Here's how to actually build identity enough without blowing up your life. Step 1. Build a portfolio identity. Just like putting every dollar into one stock is a bad idea, putting your entire identity into one role is equally reckless. So instead, you build an identity portfolio. Not one identity, but a collection of them. Your portfolio needs to encompass your career identity, your fitness identity, your creative identity, your relationship identity, social identity, curious learner identity, and the I take on challenges identity. It doesn't have to be symmetrical. It just has to be plural. The beauty in a portfolio identity is that it has resilience built in. One part can wobble without collapsing the whole thing. If career you is temporarily not doing so well, but the rest of your portfolio is thriving, then you'll feel infinitely better than if everything was rabbled up in your work identity alone. This is how you become anti-fragile. And this is also how you stop any one job from emotionally owning you. Step 2 is what I like to call the monthly experiment rule. Identity doesn't have to arrive in an epiphany. It arrives through experiments. So, once a month, try picking one experiment. Just one, nothing dramatic. Something you can try for 30 days without rearranging your whole life. Whatever you choose, commit to it for that 30 days, but with enthusiasm. Even when it feels awkward. Even when you're not good at it. Actually, especially then, because that means that you'll grow during the process. At the end of the month, ask yourself 2 questions. Did this feel like a version of me I want more of? If yes, where does it fit into my portfolio identity? If it lit something up, keep it. If it didn't, let it go with gratitude. When identity testing, you don't fail experiments. Instead, you're collecting data. And over time, you discover identities you didn't even know were inside you. Step 3. Build boundaries that protect your expansion. If you're not careful, your job will take everything you give to it. It's not malicious, it's just the nature of corporate life. Your identity needs oxygen, and it's down to you to protect that oxygen. What's crucial then is to create boundaries like identity investments. Here's what that looks like in practice. 2 evenings a week are untouchable, not for rest, but for you. One weekend morning is reserved for your identity experiments. Work hours shrink to the container you give them, not the other way round. Boundaries aren't about being rigid or doing a bad job. Rather, they're about refusing to let your job colonize the space where the rest of your life should grow. Give your identity 60 minutes a few times a week and just watch your life expand. Step 4. Don't wait for the crisis. This one's really important. Most people only start this work when things crack. A redundancy, burnout, divorce, kids leaving the nest, health scares, early retirement. Identity collapse happens because the foundation wasn't built before the storm. The goal is to be ready for it long before it arrives. So start now before you're forced to. Finally, step 5. Build pull, not push vectors. As we've discussed, a lot of people try to reinvent themselves by running away from something, whether that's work, stress, boredom, or pressure. But away is not a direction. It's just a movement. At some point, you need pull. That's the thing that feels exciting, intriguing, energizing, and aligned. Pull is what makes identity growth stick. So ask yourself, what feels interesting? What feels energizing? What feels like it might be part of future me? Follow the spark, even if it's tiny, especially if it's tiny, because the sparks are clues to what might light your fire in the future. So if you've ever felt trapped inside your job title, or afraid of who you'd be without a career, or unsure what your next chapter looks like, this episode is your reminder that you are allowed to expand, you are allowed to evolve, and you are allowed to build a life with more than one identity. In fact, you have to. Because work will always come and go, but who you are on the outside of it, that's the part you get to keep. Thanks for listening to Life After Enough, a podcast about money, meaning, and the life you design when work becomes optional. If this episode made you rethink your future, share it with someone who's starting to question the script too. You can follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Nick, and I'll see you next week as we keep building a life that's truly ours.